The sound comes first, a mechanical growl deep and rough, rolling through the clouds over northern France. A single fighter plane breaks formation. Its silver body glints under the cold sun. A Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy and defiant, pushing higher, harder, beyond what its designers ever intended. Inside, the pilot feels the vibration through his bones. The cockpit smells of fuel and hot oil. His oxygen mask hides the tremor in his breath. He knows this run shouldn't be possible, not with this engine, not with the fuel in his tanks. But he did it anyway. He mixed it himself. The dial trembles. The manifold pressure climbs. And for the first time, the Thunderbolt, America's heaviest single-engine fighter, moves like lightning. He feels it surge. The propeller screams at 2,700 revolutions per minute. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, the same monster that powered bombers, now unleashed with fuel too potent for regulations. It's no longer a safe machine. It's a barely contained explosion held together by steel, bolts, and faith. Then it hits him. The sky in front flashes, tracer fire, black puffs of flak. The Germans are awake. This is 1943. Europe burns below. And high above it, a reckless experiment is rewriting the laws of air combat. A few days earlier, in a muddy airfield in England, that same pilot stood beside his crew chief, a cigarette hanging from his lips, eyes fixed on a stack of fuel drums marked with a red stripe, 150 octane. Fuel meant for testing. Not authorized for Thunderbolts. But rules were for the safe. The living were never safe. He'd seen too many friends go down. Engines choking, Luftwaffe diving from the sun, out-climbing, out-turning the P-47. The Jug, they called it, a flying tank, yes, but too heavy, too slow to chase a Messerschmitt 109 in a climb. That night, someone whispered a rumor. RAF Spitfires had been running something new, a hotter blend, 150-octane aviation fuel. Unofficial. Dangerous. But it made their Merlins roar like devils. And so, under the dim yellow lights of a maintenance hangar, surrounded by the scent of fuel and cold metal, a small group of mechanics began to pour. No paperwork. No authorization. Just a quiet pact between men who wanted to live one more day. As the fuel flowed into the Thunderbolt's tanks, it shimmered a strange blue. They joked that it looked radioactive, the color of recklessness. When dawn came, the P-47 roared down the runway at Boxted. The pilot pulled back the stick, expecting the familiar sluggish lift. Instead, he felt the impossible power. A shove in the back that made his gut twist. He checked his instruments. The manifold pressure was beyond limits. 42 inches. 45. He could feel the engine begging to explode, but it didn't. It held. Up there, over the English Channel, he found the truth that no manual could print. The Thunderbolt had been chained by fear, not design. By that summer, the 8th Air Force was bleeding. Bomber losses in daylight raids were catastrophic. Escort fighters like the P-47 were supposed to protect them, but their range was too short. The Luftwaffe knew it. They waited at the edge of every bomber stream like wolves. The Thunderbolts would turn back and then the bombers would die. Commanders argued over strategy, engineers fought over octane ratings, and pilots stared at the sky knowing they were running out of time. So when whispers of the fuel hack began to spread across airfields, whispers of men who poured 150 octane into their tanks and came back alive, curiosity turned into desperation. In the mess halls they talked about it like ghost stories. They say it gives you 10 more inches of boost. They say it melts pistons. They say it turns the Jug into a rocket. No one really knew. And no one cared. Because the truth of war is this: when death becomes routine, risk becomes reason. At the headquarters of the 56th Fighter Group, the Wolf Pack, Colonel Hubert Zenke had heard the rumors too. A man of calculation and cold confidence, Zenke understood that innovation often came from the edge of disobedience. His pilots were wild, independent, often insubordinate, and deadly effective. He watched as one of his men, Captain Francis Gabby Gabreski, brought back his P-47 with blackened exhaust pipes and a grin under his oxygen mask. "Engine held?" Zenke asked. "Barely," Gabreski replied. But the Krauts didn't stand a chance. That night, Zenke didn't file a report. He didn't stop the experiments. He just stared at the operational board, and began to wonder how far a Thunderbolt could go before it tore itself apart. 150 octane fuel. It wasn't magic. It was chemistry, pure, volatile, unrefined power. The standard American fuel at the time was 100/130 octane, balanced for safety and longevity. But with higher octane came resistance to detonation, allowing engines to run hotter, compress harder, and deliver more boost before knocking themselves to pieces. The RAF had been experimenting with it since 1940. In the Battle of Britain, that small advantage in boost pressure, just a few inches of mercury, meant the difference between life and death. Now, in 1943, that same formula was making its way into American hands. But bureaucracy moved slower than war. The paperwork lagged behind the bodies. So the pilots made the choice themselves. The first missions with the hot fuel were chaotic. Engines overheated, superchargers screamed, and mechanics cursed. But the results were undeniable. P-47s were climbing faster, chasing FW-190s that once laughed at their weight. Their turbo-supercharged R-2800s, now fed with 150 octane, pushed over 2,300 horsepower, raw, unapproved, unrecorded. The Luftwaffe noticed. They began calling these Thunderbolts Donnerkeil, Thunderbolts of the Devil. And in the skies over occupied Europe, something shifted. At 25,000 feet, near Lille, a formation of B-17s was under attack. German fighters dived in from above, a familiar slaughter. But this time when the call went out, "Little friends, where are you?" the answer came faster than ever before. From the west, streaks of silver thundered through the cloud tops. P-47s screaming in at full throttle. Their engines howling at impossible boost pressures. They dove with the bombers, guns blazing, vapor trails twisting behind them. Gabreski would later say it was the first time he felt the jug come alive. "She didn't climb," he said, "she lunged." But every gain in war comes with a shadow. Mechanics found cracked heads, burned valves, detonation scars on pistons. They replaced engines like bandages. But the pilots kept asking for more. The line between bravery and madness blurred in the roar of those engines. In hangars across England, crews began blending fuels themselves, mixing drums from different depots, ignoring labels, experimenting like chemists in the dark. One wrong ratio could destroy a $50,000 engine. One right mix could win a dogfight. It was a kind of mechanical rebellion, born not from genius but from fear. And that's what made it so powerful. Every night, over blacked-out England, you could hear the engines testing. Bursts of sound breaking the silence. Mechanics adjusting, pilots revving, then cutting power before the cylinders detonated. The airfield smelled like gasoline and defiance. War had always rewarded innovation. But here, innovation had no permission. Those men weren't engineers from Republic or Wright Field. They were soldiers, scared, reckless, and tired of watching friends fall from the sky. In their minds there was no glory in safety. Only survival through disobedience. And somewhere, deep inside the heart of a 2,800 cubic inch radial engine, history began to turn faster. Because from that moment on, every flight was a gamble, between man and machine, between control and chaos. And for the pilots of the Thunderbolt, that gamble was worth everything. The next morning, fog hung low over the airfields of East Anglia. The grass glistened with dew. Mechanics walked like ghosts between rows of Thunderbolts, their boots sinking into the mud. Each plane bore scars, soot stains, bullet holes, patches of fresh aluminum. The war in the air was eating them alive. Engines roared to life one by one, the deep radio growl echoing across the countryside. The R-2800s coughed, sputtered, then settled into a heavy rhythmic pulse. The kind of sound that vibrated through your ribs and reminded you, this was power you could die inside. Inside the cockpit, the pilots went through the same ritual. Gloves, harness, oxygen line, magneto check. But their eyes always went back to the same thing, the boost gauge. The one number that meant life or death. Every pilot knew the red line. 52 inches of manifold pressure. Beyond that, you entered the unknown. Some called it the devil's throttle. Others called it Zemke's zone. They pushed it anyway. In one Thunderbolt, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a quiet kid from Oklahoma, ran his pre-flight check. The night before, his crew chief had added a secret note on the dash. Blue mix. Run hot. Johnson didn't ask questions. He just smiled and pulled the canopy shut. Minutes later, his squadron climbed through the overcast, breaking into sunlight at 20,000 feet. The world below vanished into a sea of white. Up here there was only cold, silence, and death waiting somewhere ahead. The radio crackled. Bandits. 11 o'clock high. The formation tightened. And then, dots. Tiny specks, growing fast. Focke-Wulfs. Messerschmitts. The Luftwaffe's killers, sleek and agile. Johnson felt his heartbeat slow. He pushed the throttle forward, past the limit. The needle trembled. The engine groaned and the cockpit filled with a sharp, metallic hiss. The Thunderbolt shook like it wanted to tear itself apart. Then came the kick. The big radial engine caught the new fuel, and the jug surged forward like a fist thrown at the sky. The German formation overshot, unprepared for the brute acceleration. Johnson rolled inverted dove and squeezed the trigger. The 8.50 caliber Brownings roared in unison, ripping the air with a storm of lead. A Messerschmitt disintegrated under his guns. Another pulled away, smoking. When he leveled out, Johnson realized he was still alive. His hands trembled, his mouth was dry. The engine temperature was in the red. But the plane held together. Later, on the ground, his crew found scorch marks on the cowling and a cracked cylinder head. Johnson only said, "She took me there and back." Stories like that spread faster than official memos. Word of the 150-octane miracle reached every squadron across the 8th Air Force. Pilots began to whisper about Thunderbolts that could outrun death. But headquarters was furious. Unapproved modifications meant liability. Commanders feared engine failures over enemy lines, diplomatic issues with British fuel stocks, and chaos in logistics. Yet the men in the field didn't stop. They couldn't. Because by then, survival wasn't about following orders. It was about adapting faster than the enemy could learn your weaknesses. Somewhere in Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence analysts began filing strange reports. American fighter performance increasing beyond expected limits. Possible new engine modification. They were right and wrong. There was no secret weapon, no factory breakthrough. Just ordinary men running extraordinary risks. In war, desperation becomes evolution. As 1944 dawned, the air war entered a new phase. The Allies were preparing for something vast, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe. And air superiority was no longer a wish, it was survival for every man set to storm the beaches of Normandy. The P-47 had a reputation, rugged, heavy, unkillable. It could dive like a meteor and absorb punishment no other fighter could. But it needed something more, endurance, speed, and altitude performance to fight deep over enemy territory. Fuel was the answer. The simplest element of war, yet the most decisive. By mid-spring, under pressure from field reports, the U.S. Army Air Forces authorized limited use of 150-octane fuel for the P-47 and P-51. It was official now, but too late to claim control. The pilots had been running it for months. The tests confirmed what the reckless few already knew. With 150 octane, the Thunderbolt could safely boost to 70 inches of manifold pressure, a figure once thought suicidal. Its climb rate improved by over 1,000 feet per minute. Its top speed jumped past 430 miles per hour. It was no longer just a flying tank. It was a predator. By then, the Wolfpack was the most lethal fighter group in Europe. Zemke's men had turned the Thunderbolt into a symbol of raw American defiance, a mix of engineering and audacity. The pilots wore leather jackets darkened by oil and sweat. Their planes bore nose art, snarling wolves, pin-up girls, and phrases like, "No rules above 30,000 feet." When they took off, mechanics watched in silence. Some prayed. Others just listened, to the sound of the jug's engine climbing into the distance, knowing that if it coughed once, the whole machine could vanish in flame. In one mission over Germany, Gabreski himself pushed his boost to 72 inches chasing an FW-190. His plane vibrated so violently that the gun sight glass cracked. But he caught the enemy, fired, and turned away before the engine cooked itself. When he landed, the ground crew stared at the melted spark plugs and said, "You're lucky it didn't explode." Gabreski just grinned, "She's got more left." There was something intoxicating about that kind of risk. It wasn't arrogance, it was survival disguised as courage. The men knew that every time they opened the throttle, they were gambling their lives against physics. But in the chaos of war, physics was negotiable. Meanwhile, across the channel, Luftwaffe pilots began to notice the change. Their radios filled with angry German voices, "Die Thunderbolts, das ist Klettern." They climb now. The balance of air combat had shifted. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Reich. The Thunderbolts roamed deep into German airspace, strafing trains, convoys, and airfields. They became hunters, relentless, unstoppable, and loud. But beneath the triumph, something darker brewed. Every mechanic knew the toll. Engines burned out after a handful of missions. Supply depots couldn't keep up. The miracle of performance came at the cost of reliability and lives. Still, no one turned back. Because in war, progress never asks for permission. And so, the myth of the Reckless Thunderbolt grew. Not as a story of sanctioned engineering, but of human defiance. Those pilots didn't just fight the enemy, they fought the limits of their own machines. And in doing so, they discovered a truth that every generation of warriors would learn again. Sometimes the line between genius and madness is drawn in octane. The air war over Europe was reaching its breaking point. By May 1944, every dawn began the same. The distant hum of engines over England, the endless stream of bombers lifting into a gray sky, and behind them, the silver guardians of the 8th Air Force, climbing in spirals toward the front. Each pilot knew what waited across the channel. Black smoke, tracer fire, and the invisible lines of German radar sweeping the clouds. For the Thunderbolt pilots, it had become routine. But nothing about it was ever normal. The cockpit was an oven. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees. Sweat collected under flight suits. Oxygen masks itched against skin rubbed raw from hours in the air. The canopy rattled as air rushed past. And always, there was that low, constant vibration, the heartbeat of the R-2800 shaking like a caged animal. They trusted that sound. When it faltered, they knew death was coming. At 26,000 feet, a pilot's mind starts to drift. The world below is a quilt of destruction. Burning towns, winding rivers, rail lines crawling with smoke. Somewhere beneath that haze were millions of lives, untouched and unknown. But up here, the war was personal. Metal against metal, reflex against reflex. That's where the reckless came in. Most of the men who dared to run hot fuel weren't rebels by nature. They were kids, farm boys, mechanics, sons of small towns. But war had turned them into something else. The ones who survived learned that sometimes, orders were just slower versions of truth. And truth was simple. 150 octane worked. Official tests now backed what the pilots had proven in blood. The new fuel gave the Thunderbolt an edge, a terrifying, exhilarating edge. The sound of the R-2800 changed. It wasn't just a growl anymore, it was a scream, higher-pitched, alive with combustion so fierce it seemed almost conscious. From the ground, you could hear it long before you saw the planes. Farmers in Normandy would look up and say the sky was tearing open. But even as the Thunderbolt became a symbol of dominance, its pilots carried a quiet dread. They knew their engines were running on borrowed time. The same high compression that made them gods in the sky could also kill them without warning. In briefing tents, you'd hear conversations whispered in half-jokes. "How long you think she'll last?" "Long enough to get me home." They laughed, but their eyes didn't. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert "Punchy" Powell, later recalled how it felt. "You never forgot that your engine was one heartbeat away from turning you into a torch. But when you had a Messerschmitt on your tail, you didn't think about that. You just pushed the throttle and prayed." The line between bravery and insanity had evaporated. By early June, that line was crossed forever. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Operation Overlord. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. Before the first boats hit the beaches, the Thunderbolts were already there, streaking low over Normandy, strafing roads, smashing artillery, cutting communication lines. They flew so low that the smell of cordite and sea salt filled their cockpits. The Jug, once mocked for its size, became the hammer of invasion. It could take hits that would shatter a Mustang. It could dive straight into flak and come out smoking but alive. And now, fueled by 150 octane, it was faster, deadlier, and angrier than ever before. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but their numbers were crumbling. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the constant harassment of Allied fighters left them fighting ghosts. For the German aces who once dominated the sky, it was a new nightmare. The enemy no longer played by the rules of physics. There's a story, half rumor, half truth, of a Luftwaffe pilot who radioed in disbelief. "Die Donnerjager, they climb like rockets." The Americans never heard it, but if they had, they would have smiled. because that was exactly what they wanted the enemy to believe. As the Allies pushed inland, Thunderbolts became flying artillery. They destroyed tanks, bridges, trains, anything that moved. Pilots returned to base with guns empty, wings blackened by smoke and fuel tanks nearly dry. Some landed with engines literally glowing red. Others never made it back. The fuel that made them untouchable could just as easily turn them into fireballs. Yet for every plane lost, 2 more took off. The production lines back home never stopped. America's industrial might fed the sky with an endless storm. Still, in the quiet hours after missions, when the airfields went dark and only the ticking of cooling engines remained, some pilots couldn't sleep. They'd stare at their planes, machines built for power, not mercy, and wonder what exactly they'd become. They weren't engineers. They were survivors of their own invention. War had taught them that innovation wasn't born in laboratories. It was born in fear, in the shaking hands that poured forbidden fuel into steel beasts because they refused to die quietly. And that truth, that dark, reckless truth, would shape the very future of air combat. By the time the P-47 reached its zenith, it was no longer just a fighter. It was a prototype for every idea that came after, every jet, every engine, every gamble that traded caution for dominance. Even the new Mustangs, sleek, elegant, the darlings of the press, owed their success to the same principle. With 150-octane fuel, they too became monsters of performance. But for the men of the Thunderbolt, pride was mixed with resentment. They had been the test pilots of desperation. The ones who broke the rules so others could be safe. And deep down, they knew, history would remember the machines, not the men who risked everything to change them. Still they flew. Every day through the summer of 1944, they flew until the engines screamed, until their hands shook, until the sky itself seemed to burn. They didn't fly for medals. Or for orders. They flew because the alternative was worse. The alternative was silence. By the autumn of 1944, the sky over Europe had changed. The smoke that once belonged to German guns now came from burning cities, collapsing fronts, and the wreckage of the Luftwaffe itself. But the Thunderbolts still flew. They hunted anything that moved, trains, trucks, convoys, fuel depots. They tore through enemy lines with .50 caliber fury, leaving only silence behind. The men who once trembled at flak bursts now measured fear differently, by how far the needle on their manifold gauge could climb before the engine quit. By now, the 150-octane fuel wasn't a secret. It was the lifeblood of victory. Every Allied airfield from Britain to France stored drums of it, marked with warning labels no one bothered to read anymore. The system had caught up to the rebellion, but the spirit behind it never died. Colonel Zemke, the mastermind behind the Wolfpack, knew it better than anyone. He'd seen how his men had turned the Thunderbolt from a clumsy brute into a weapon of precision and terror. But he'd also seen what it cost them. Engines burned out mid-flight. Compressors failed catastrophically. And when the fuel mixture went wrong, there was no time for a mayday call, just a flash in the clouds and a name crossed off the board. Zemke stood on the tarmac one morning as a recovery team brought back what was left of a Thunderbolt. Only a twisted engine block and a single wing panel with the word "Lucky" still painted on it. He didn't say anything. He just lit a cigarette and stared at the horizon. That was the paradox of war, progress measured in wreckage. But the mission went on. In September, the Allies advanced toward the Rhine. The Luftwaffe, bleeding and desperate, threw everything they had left into the air. Jet prototypes, hastily trained boys, aircraft without fuel. And yet, every time they took off, the Thunderbolts were there. One encounter near the German town of Kassel would become legend. A formation of Thunderbolts from the 362nd Fighter Group dove through overcast to find a convoy of German armor below. The lead pilot, Major George Bostwick, pushed his engine far past the red line, 75 inches of boost, 3,000 revolutions per minute, unheard of numbers. The Jug screamed like a banshee, diving almost vertically. His guns opened up at 500 yards, shells ripping through the column below. But when he tried to pull out, the stick froze. The plane trembled violently. The G-forces crushed his chest. The engine howled, overboosted, over-revved, almost molten. For a split second he thought it was over. Then, miraculously, the nose leveled. He skimmed the treetops, barely conscious, engine still screaming like an angry god. When he landed, the motor ceased completely. The mechanics called it a miracle. Bostwick didn't talk much after that. But in his flight log he scribbled 2 words, held together. That phrase became an unspoken prayer for every pilot who climbed into a Thunderbolt. Because that's what the P-47 was at its core, not perfection but endurance. It didn't win because it was elegant. It won because it refused to die. Every rivet, every panel, every drop of 150-octane fuel in its tanks was a testament to that defiance. As the months dragged on, that defiance became routine. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's presence had thinned to shadows. The real enemy now was fatigue, physical, mechanical, and moral. Pilots flew until their hands shook. Mechanics slept on hangar floors. Engines were swapped like light bulbs. The war had turned into a machine that consumed its own inventors. In one squadron diary, a crew chief wrote, "Every night we take the broken ones apart. Every morning they go back up. We know it's killing them, but the sky won't stay empty." The war was ending, but it didn't feel that way. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their final counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. It was chaos all over again. Snow, fog, freezing airfields. 4 days the weather grounded Allied planes. Then, on December 23, the clouds broke. And the Thunderbolts went hunting. From dawn to dusk, they pounded the German offensive, destroying tanks, cutting supply lines, shattering morale. The sky roared with the sound of vengeance. One pilot, Lieutenant Herschel Green, recalled, "We didn't think. We just went. Every run, every shot, every pass, it was the same. You didn't feel human anymore. Just an extension of the plane. The fuel burned hotter than anything I'd ever smelled. It was like flying inside a bomb." In that frozen sky, the last remnants of the Luftwaffe fell. Not with ceremony but with exhaustion. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Thunderbolts led the way. Their engines, those roaring, defiant machines, had carried them from the desperation of 1943 to the doorstep of victory. But now something was changing again. The war was almost over, and whispers of a new kind of power began to circulate. Jet engines. Jet fuel. A new world, faster, colder, less human. The men who had risked everything with octane and courage were suddenly relics of another era. Yet their legacy burned bright. Because what they'd proven in those chaotic, unauthorized experiments was more than chemistry. They had shown that progress in war, and in life, often comes not from order but from chaos. They had taught the world that sometimes, rules must break before machines can truly fly. As Germany fell and the thunder over Europe faded, the men of the P-47 scattered. Some went home, others stayed for occupation duty, flying over the ruins they'd helped create. And among them was that same pilot, the one from the beginning. He stood beside his Thunderbolt, hand on the cowling still warm from flight. The paint was blistered, the nose art almost burned away. He didn't say much. Just stared at the engine that had carried him through hell and back. It was over. But the echo of that engine, that reckless, defiant roar, would never leave him. When the war finally began to quiet, the skies over Europe carried a different sound. No longer the endless roar of engines but silence, heavy, absolute, almost unnatural. The men who had once lived inside that noise now found themselves stranded in stillness. Some couldn't sleep without the vibration of the propeller beneath their feet. Others woke at night, hearing phantom engines that no longer existed. The Thunderbolt had carried them through hell. But now it was parked. The barrels of 150-octane fuel stood unused, the smell of benzene and lead still floating in the air, clinging to hangar walls like a ghost that refused to leave. And as victory banners went up across Europe, the pilots didn't cheer. They just stared at their machines. Because deep down they knew, they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had taken a weapon born from regulation and bureaucracy and turned it into something else. Something alive. Something dangerous. A creature that answered only to those reckless enough to speak its language. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never graceful, never elegant. But in their hands, it became untouchable. Not because it was perfect, but because they stopped waiting for permission to make it better. That's what no report, no archive, no official record ever fully captured. Not the horsepower. Not the kill counts. Not even the victories. What defined the Thunderbolt was defiance, that quiet decision to push further when reason said no. And when that decision worked, the whole air war shifted. From the summer of 1944 onward, the Luftwaffe's grip on the sky began to crumble. American bomber streams pushed deeper into the heart of Germany, covered by squadrons of Thunderbolts running hotter, faster, and higher than anyone thought possible. Those who flew them felt a strange mix of triumph and dread, because the same fuel that kept them alive was rewriting the laws of their own survival. Every mission became a gamble with chemistry and combustion. Every drop of 150 octane carried both hope and risk. And in that razor-thin balance between destruction and endurance, something human broke free, that pure, impossible instinct to survive through invention. By the final months of the war, the Thunderbolt was no longer the underdog. It was the standard. It had outlasted its rivals, outflown its critics, and outroared the doubt of its own engineers. Men who once cursed its weight now trusted it with their lives. Men who once feared its sluggishness now pushed it to altitudes where oxygen froze in their masks. The Jug, as they called it, became a legend, not because of what it was, but because of what they dared to make it. And when peace finally came, those same men looked around the airfields, expecting some great release, a catharsis after years of noise. Instead there was nothing. Just wind sweeping across the runways, whispering through the open cowlings of silent engines. War had given them purpose. But peace demanded they put that purpose away. Some stayed in aviation. Some couldn't bear to touch another cockpit. Yet all of them carried the same invisible weight, the memory of that reckless moment when they broke the rules and found power waiting on the other side. No one would ever write that into the manuals. No one would officially record that a handful of mechanics and pilots had changed the course of air combat by simply pouring a different mix into a tank. But the truth didn't need paperwork. It lived in the way their eyes shifted when they spoke of those flights, the way their voices dropped, like recalling a secret too dangerous to say aloud. Because the Thunderbolt had taught them something no classroom could. That fear and innovation are not enemies. They are twins born of desperation. One keeps you alive. The other forces you to evolve. In the cockpit of a P-47 with 1,000 feet of climb left and the fuel gauge falling, those two forces met face to face. And in that collision something like courage took shape. Years later, when jet engines arrived and the piston age began to fade, the engineers still looked back to the data from those old Thunderbolts. They studied how far the R-2800 could be pushed before it cracked, how much power could be drawn before the propeller lost its grip. And they learned that progress isn't born in laboratories. It's born in fear, in risk, in the hands of those who are reckless enough to try. So the Thunderbolt became a myth, not because it was flawless but because it was human. A machine built to the edge of reason, carried further by men who didn't know how to stop. And when you look at the sky today, at the contrails of jet fighters slicing through the blue, you can still trace the ghost of that old propeller turning, somewhere in memory pushing against the limits one last time. The war ended. But the lesson of the Thunderbolt never did. Because every innovation, every impossible leap, begins the same way. With one reckless idea, and the will to survive it. And as long as there are men and women willing to take that risk, the echo of that old engine will never fade. So if you ever wonder what courage sounds like, don't look for speeches. Listen for the thunder. And if you want to hear more of the forgotten stories that shaped the skies, subscribe, and stay with us as we continue to uncover the truths born from war's most reckless dreams.